Okay, that's done that now. Okay, right. So I'm going to keep an eye on the time and try not to talk for too long, so there's time to kind of discuss or share stories or whatever. Okay, so yes, as CJ said, my background tends to be in, well, my background is in the social sciences, and I looked at British spirit medium experiences of spirit for my PhD about 10 years ago now. How time flies. But this is kind of I've been interested in ghosts for forever, really. And particularly interested in ghost lore, and my approach tends to be an agnostic one. So I'm kind of interested in what it is that people believe, the role of ghosts within popular culture, and so that this talk is going to take some of those sorts of themes. But this is kind of work that I'm doing for a book, which I've been writing for a long time. I have a horrible feeling that I've started most of my ASSAP talks with that line, which is embarrassing, but it's slowly getting there. But this is a particular chapter that's looking at this role of certain aspects of the kind of ghosts that people believe in, that are in particular different religious systems, etc., etc. So I want to focus particularly on the role of victims and villains in the afterlife. So I'm kind of touching on the darker side, I think, of ghost lore, and thinking in particular about the ways in which I think sometimes kind of fictional representations kind of weave in with beliefs and anecdotes and experiences. So there will be some kind of weaving in of these two different things, which I'll try and make sense of. But thinking about kind of what we can see in regards to victims and villains in the afterlife. So just to kind of get, acknowledge this, of course, there's a huge amount of kind of ghost beliefs or spirit beliefs that do articulate the idea that spirits are benevolent or at least benign. So the idea of, the darker stuff that I'm going to talk about this evening isn't really, this is not representative of the whole kind of canon of ghost lore, if you like. So obviously, I mean, much of my research was kind of based in this area. Yeah, but, there's lots of areas in which that spirits are thought to actively aid the living, that they're benevolent. Spiritualism, for example, focuses on a benevolent connection between the living and the dead. The living are there to look after us, watch over us. There may be something quite particular about, particular within spiritualist cosmology, that the spirits actually reside in the spirit world, in the summer land, or a variant of that, and that they're able to travel back really to make contact with us. So the purpose of kind of relationships between the living and the dead is they're often to do with family members reconnecting with each other, and it's about love, and it's about kind of connection and all of those kind of things. Of course, there are a huge number, I think, and I think a lot of you will probably know these a lot better than I do, but there's loads and loads of reports of spirit experiences where I guess the best way to kind of capture that is that these spirits are ultimately benign, and in many cases they seem to be pretty oblivious to the living. And on a personal note, this is something that really interests me in regards to, whether ghosts exist or not, is, the relevance as to whether or not spirits are actually conscious of the living. They're aware of you and they respond to you. Because there are loads of stories of, seeing a grey lady walk down a corridor that doesn't recognize you in any way. And I know that there are various interpretations of that, to do with kind of it being a playback of some sort, or that these might not actually be individual conscious spirits, but actually some kind of almost captured echo, if you like. So obviously this is kind of, there's a strong element in which, that ghosts actually are quite benevolent, or at least they're some sort of echo of the past, if you like. And of course, in a lot of societies, we see the significance of ancestor spirits that may occupy a kind of a guardian role over the living. They work in what we might term cultural perpetuity, which is the ongoing nature of a society as it moves, as it kind of goes through its generations. So obviously, I recognize that's, that's quite significant. And I suppose in some ways, we can understand why this kind of ghost lore is quite attractive, but also why it's quite meaningful to us. So it's kind of interesting to think, okay, but also why is there quite a rich folklore and quite a rich collection of stories about ghosts that are not like this? So, without wanting to be cliched, here's I ain't afraid of no ghosts, say some people. I found this lovely quote from he's a television chat show host, I think, called Dick Cavett, who made this point. He said, why are people afraid of ghosts? Oh no, I wouldn't want to see one. I'd be too scared. Accompanied by a tremolo of fear in the voice is the common reaction. This puzzles me. I think anyone would welcome the opportunity. I've never heard of a ghost hurting anybody. I thought, that's really interesting. So, in the spirit of science, let's test this presumption. It reminds me, an alternative quote, which I've heard a few times actually, is, I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm frightened of them, which is also something really interesting. Anyway, moving on. Let's start with a kind of spooky story, if you like. So this is a story, this is a folklore story that kind of captures this idea of some of the aspects of why, in a sense, the dead or the ghost might be quite frightening. And this is a story that comes from Sweden. And, it's interesting, isn't it, when they thinking about the long winters that they have in Sweden. I mean, England feels as though that has long winters too, but in Sweden, it can get very dark for long periods of time. And they have an idea of the dead as being restless and greedy, which I think is quite interesting. So this idea of being in these cold times where you're trapped in your house, and this, knowing that there are things outside of the safe circle of the heath that were best not risked or even thought of. So this idea that's perpetuated, and this is similar in many cultures, that actually the dead are to be feared. And they, you don't go into their territory, and, particularly at night, they are something to be, warded against. Now, in this particular story, and I think there are variations of this in various other places, what we find is a young woman who is kind of caught out, and she goes into a church and she thinks she's safe, and she goes and she sits down, and then she realizes that she's actually surrounded by members of the community that have died. And they're in various different stages of kind of decomposition. So it's not really how you want to spend an evening, I wouldn't think. And what happens is that, they kind of all start grabbing onto her, and she gets very frightened. So she gets up and runs, she runs away, and, they've almost got her, and they tear her shawl, and her shawl falls off and she runs away. But she goes to visit the vicar or the priest, and they go back to the church, to say what has happened, and they go back to the church together. And what they found is there's absolutely nobody there, but there's her tattered shawl ripped to pieces lying on the floor. So those kind of and yet, I mean, there's so many interesting things about this story, I think, bearing in mind that these are actually members of the community, so you might not expect them to behave like that. But there is this idea, I think, it's that the dead are terrifying, and ghosts are terrifying, and that they will try and take you with them if they can. And these perhaps are ideas that are common in other cultures, perhaps more than ours. But it's this kind of idea that actually the dead are something to be feared that I'm kind of quite interested in researching at the moment. But I think that's kind of a nice story to set the tone. So basically, when we're thinking about ghosts, and we're thinking particularly about malevolent ghosts, again, they're ghost lore, so ghost folklore, or kind of collections of experiences of ghosts or beliefs in ghosts. It's full of stories of ghosts that will seek to do you harm if they can. And I think particularly in fiction, and this is why I think it's important to kind of think about the way in which the fictional representations of spirits and things kind of interweave. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more later. They kind of interweave within in public consciousness. So I think most of us can probably think about scary ghost films that we've seen, and there are certain ghost films that are very, very popular, and the characters seem to be perpetuated a lot, kind of like Count Dracula and Frankenstein's monster and those kind of things. But certainly I think a lot of ghost stories, maybe that's because scary ghost stories are the most entertaining, and we turn to ghosts in our stories for a good scare. They do seem to be pretty malevolent in nature. And again, I think what's kind of the sort of stories that I'm interested in this context are kind of anecdotes of experiences that would say that they feel that the ghosts are malevolent, or certainly experiences that feel malevolent. So I know that there are a whole load of ghost experiences that are scary because they're unexpected. It's a bump in the night, or people don't know what's going on, or any of those sorts of things. But I think for this area, I'm particularly interested in things where people would say, no, I really felt that was malevolent. That house was malevolent. That spirit was malevolent. And I think so it's making that distinction, that it's not just about, oh God, I've been disturbed by a ghost. This is about where people actually feel that it's, you know, this spirit has malevolent intentions towards me. So what I've kind of been looking at, particularly over the last kind of couple of years in regards to this, is that in a sense, I kind of think, well, where do these ghosts come from? And maybe this is the kind of therapist in me, you know, what is kind of at the root of potentially at the root of these sort of experiences and these kind of, you know, in a sense, what makes ghosts malevolent? Because we have so many spirits that are loving and benevolent, and, you know, what is it that can happen that might make ghosts malevolent? And I found there's quite a significant relationship, I think, between historical circumstances of violence and tragedy. And I think that's really important for kind of a setting for these kind of stories. But I think there's also a reflection of this conception that some people are evil. And this comes out. And I think perhaps part of the terrifying possibility of ghosts, we think about, you know, we can all think about people that we may believe, or at least be inclined to believe, are just evil. That, you know, well, what happens once they're kind of free of their bodies? That's a pretty scary thought. You know, what if they don't go on somewhere else and they're trapped here? That really is a scary thought. And just kind of a quick note about, I mean, it's obviously the relationship between ghosts and Christianity is much more complex than this, and it would be a talk in itself. But I think it's kind of useful to think, because obviously if we think about Britain, for example, that obviously has been kind of had the influence of Christianity as kind of a main way of seeing the world for several centuries. You know, there's some kind of really interesting ways in which kind of ghosts kind of relate to Christianity or Christian cosmology, for example. So if you, I mean, R.C. Finucane's book, Appearances of the Dead, is just, it's still, I think, one of the most outstanding books about this subject of kind of the nature of ghosts throughout the centuries. So he kind of identifies this point about the role of purgatory as being this in-between place where the dead actually need the aid of the living. And this is a way in which I think that there's a victim, there's a sort of, you know, that people who, they've kind of made mistakes. And sometimes the role of ghosts is seen as that they're coming back to kind of, you know, that the thing is, within Catholicism, prayers for the dead actually can aid the dead and actually kind of secure their release from purgatory. So sometimes ghosts would act in a way of, you know, kind of, you know, that they're appealing for help, and but also letting you know you really don't want to end up here like me, you know, sort yourself out. And yet when we see in Protestantism, generally within the Protestant cosmology, ghosts are thought to be not possible, because it's considered that, you know, when you die, you go to heaven or you go to hell, and that's it. There's no movement after that. So this, in a sense, obviously, but people continue to see ghosts when Protestantism becomes kind of more of a dominant kind of position. But the explanation at those kind of times is that, well, this is probably demons. This is demons masquerading as ghosts of the departed. Now, those of you who watch things like Ghost Adventures and all those glorious ghost investigation programs will probably, particularly the American ones, I think, will probably be aware of this. You get a lot of this idea of that, you know, malevolent ghosts are probably demons masquerading as ghosts. And I think that's kind of interesting in itself. I think I had a Ghost Adventures episode on the other day, and it was about the Sally house in America, where it was initially thought to be the spirit of a child, but the later kind of thought is that actually, no, this is a demonic entity. And there's something about Zach Bagans and everything being demonic, that anyway. But there's certainly this idea that actually that it becomes something to do with the demonic. And this, sometimes I think when you're studying kind of malevolence and spirits, there's a lot of stuff about kind of demons being malevolent and seeming like ghosts, or, you know, so I'm kind of particularly interested in the spirits of people rather than, but these things are often all kind of interconnected. And again, we have kind of specific idea about cultural conceptions of evil there. Okay, so firstly, I think I kind of separated this into kind of victims and villains, because in a sense, I think that these are two kind of really interesting main themes in regards to particularly the folklore, but also in regards to certain belief systems that kind of underlie some of what might be considered to be malevolent hauntings. So I often quote this book, which is an ethnography by an anthropologist called Malin Gustafsson, who I actually found out yesterday actually died a few years ago, like really quite young. And I'm quite sad about that, because it's a beautiful ethnography. And she was working within Vietnam and looking at experiences of spirit possession. And what was kind of really interesting in her work is that she talks about what are known as the Con Ma, which are known as the angry dead. And of course, because she was working at a time that was not that long after the end of the Vietnam War, she was like interviewing a lot of people actually who felt that they were being possessed by their Conmar ancestors, because the problem in this concept is that burial is very important, and being able to process people, that sounds quite clinical, but being able to bury and respect and the various rituals and rites that are associated with that, really, really, really important. So if that doesn't happen, and of course it didn't, because you had thousands of, hundreds of people whose bodies we don't know what happened to them. And this has had a knock-on effect, because none of these spirits can pass on. So it's called War in Shadows. It's a really, really beautiful book. That she kind of talks about, that actually these spirits become intertwined with their living kind of relatives in a very kind of difficult way. So a lot of the illnesses that they were experiencing were kind of said to be, well, this is the root, the cause is that the spirit isn't happy, because they're kind of trapped in this sort of in-between realm. And I think there's also this relationship with collective trauma. And I think this is kind of what her ethnography was about. It's a consequence of the trauma of being involved in that kind of a war, and actually how that influenced the culture. So I think there is something about, particularly about collective or cultural trauma and the aftermath of that. I mean, another example is in Japan after the tsunami, which obviously completely decimated areas of Japan and killed thousands of people. But there is now, there are lots of stories of ghosts kind of just walking up and down by the seashore, and also apparently there's an increase of ghosts getting into cars, into taxis. It's that kind of phantom hitchhiker type trope, to try and so it's almost like it's this kind of lingering aftermath of these particularly traumatic events. There's also, I think, there's something that's I think a lot of you will be familiar with, is this idea about the ghosts of victims and what happens to them after they die. There's often been a kind of this is very common within folklore, particularly in this country, but also in kind of anecdotes of ghost experiences stretching back for several hundred years, is this idea of victims actually seeking justice. There was a case, and the specifics escape me, in which actually somebody was brought to trial by a ghost. I'll have to try and sorry, the specifics, but anyways, you can see it was in some cases taken quite clearly. But this idea about, if somebody's done you wrong, you want justice, and you won't rest until justice has been achieved. There's also something quite interesting about this, I think, exposure of secrets, and this comes up probably more in fiction than it does elsewhere. This idea about these, particularly sort of family secrets, and that effectively ghosts want to expose these secrets, which is kind of interesting. There's quite a few people have written about the way in which we can see cycles of abuse. So it's not uncommon for the abused to become the abuser in the afterlife, and I think that kind of replicates, well, that's kind of quite similar to ideas about cycles of abuse within families, for example, that's talked about in some theory. Again, we're getting into this element of collective and cultural trauma and what happens after that, and how, in a way, that creates ghosts. There's also something that's quite significant, I think, is the kind of a rage at abuse, and in some ways, the kind of in which ghosts actually may become these embodiments of really untethered rage. And I think, so this is the scene on the right from the film franchise The Grudge, which was originally an East Asian film franchise, but it's been replicated, of course, in America. So some of you may have seen that film. And the story is basically around a mother and child who are killed by the husband, father, and they basically contaminate the house. And it's the belief system is that effectively they are just rage. There's nothing, that is all that they be. It's kind of their rage of the injustice of that events that kind of becomes the spirits. So lo and behold, anybody who enters into that house. There's another issue in which they're very indiscriminate. So it's almost as if it kind of boils down to something very specific. Okay. But then, of course, there's also, I think, the significance of villains and of violence, and the role that has, or the aftermath of that has, within kind of afterlife beliefs and things. So this is kind of a, you know, I'm sure most, if not all of you, have seen at least one episode of Most Haunted, and particularly during the kind of, you know, seasons that featured the sadly late Derek Acora, that he would you know, he was kind of vulnerable to becoming possessed by these actually quite unpleasant, yeah, spirits that were quite aggressive. I'm not going to say, you know, about the legitimacy of that. You know, I'm actually more interested in kind of, you know, interested in how that was presented and what that might mean. But I think it's kind of interesting that, you know, and I've seen this, or certainly heard plenty of anecdotes about this from ghost investigators, about, you know, kind of there being these particular malevolent spirits that you have to be frightened of, that you have to be wary of, sorry. And I think there's something about, you know, they're often connected to these figures of abusive power. So it's like prison guards or teachers, or it's some sort of person who has power over other people. And that in a way, what happens is that they continue to have that and to maintain that power over somewhere. Which I think is a really, really frightening thought within itself. But I mean, what I thought was kind of interesting, it's in the now kind of, I think, quite infamous episode with Derek, where he becomes possessed, I think it is by a jailer, and this is the one that was supposedly, he has the anagram of Derek Faker, I think. But, you know, it was kind of, there were similar episodes, similar kind of themes, of the sense in which, you know, it's these actually people who were really quite, you know, they're not the sort of people that you'd take home to meet your mother for tea, and yet they kind of they hold on to their power. So there's something about power here that's quite interesting, and often these spirits can be quite territorial. I think there's something really interesting about the fact that, you know, most of us live in houses that have been lived in by other people. You know, most of the places that we visit have been there for long periods of time, and so what is that, you know, and this, in this kind of age of the significance of ownership, that's kind of quite important, you know, and I mean, writers like Stephen King have been kind of interested in this idea about that. What's scary is when kind of the paranormal invades the normal, it invades the everyday. But it's, you know, you do sometimes find that actually that the ghosts actually can really rage against you coming into their own space and trying to make your home their own. And there was a series, I think it was called The Living and the Dead. I've seen so many of them. They're starting to merge into one, in which a medium and a kind of a team would go into houses where they were having problems with their kind of the supernatural activity, and actually, you know, it almost felt there was this tussle of ownership between the current owners and the spirit owners, which is kind of interesting, you know. And actually, you know, there are lots of anecdotes to suggest that actually the spirits actually can inflict harm. You know, I'm sure you've all seen pictures of scratches and things like that. So yes, that stuff is I do find some of it quite scary. I think there's also a sense in which we can think of haunting in the sense of kind of the haunting, almost like an aura or an air of atmosphere of something. So for example, like the haunting of people who did terrible things, or the way in which, you know, people feel haunted by this idea that there's this unseen kind of phantom who's doing things we don't know, you know, this idea of kind of things that we don't fully know, that yeah, so it's kind of using haunting perhaps in a slightly different sense. And again, it's kind of this idea that power actually kind of retains a stranglehold over the present. There's some interesting, I think it's kind of interesting about the relationship between the past and the present kind of wanting to move forward, and when the past sometimes almost kind of literally wants to kind of drag you back. But I think there's also there's some interesting research that's looked at the ghost law within slave populations in America, and you know, that there was some kind of interesting stories about, you know, this deep anxiety that what would happen when the slave owner died, and the idea that even when the slave owner died, you would still never be free of them. And you know, there's lots of other kind of influences of that, particularly in societies where if they suffered under a dictator. And so it's this there's something about power here, I think. Okay, but just turning then to ways. Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, so thinking about actually how these, I guess this is some case studies really, of how these things kind of manifest in different ways. I think particularly when it comes to kind of like villains in the afterlife, I think fiction has a huge role in influencing our understanding of that. And that often, you know, we find these stories that are about these kind of really quite powerful, quite kind of frightening, malevolent spirits. So two examples I picked are F.G. Cotham's Dark Echo, which is about a guy called Harry Spalding, who basically had this beautiful boat that's called the Dark Echo. I don't know if I'd want to buy a boat called the Dark Echo, but there you go. And this has been linked to lots of violent deaths of subsequent owners. And I don't want to spoil the ending because it's a really, yeah, it's great. There's a kind of really interesting role here about how actually the kind of protagonist kind of battles with this sort of insipid kind of negative presence, and how they kind of, you know, sort that out. But there's also this kind of a significant role of black magic, which features much more strongly within fiction than I think it does in kind of the more general kind of experiences of ghost lore. And that, you know, in a sense, I think black magic aids to one's power. So yeah. And then secondly, there's Joe Hill, who is the son of Stephen King's. This is his debut, which is called Heart-Shaped Box, which is basically a story about a rock star who buys through auction a haunted suit. And it is, you know, he knows it's haunted because that's what you do. And, you know, then of course he starts getting haunted, etc., etc. And what it kind of turns out is that, you know, he's basically being haunted by the late stepfather of a former partner of his. And this late stepfather is a really unpleasant character. So it's getting into a similar kind of like the battle of, you know, kind of good and evil, if you like. But I think one of the things in these instances as well is that in both cases, the truth of the spectre must be revealed and banished. And there's a really kind of funny tally actually with, if you think about like some of the stories about demonic possessions, it's saying the name of the demon is what banishes them. So there's a similar sense here in which actually they have to find out the truth of what they're dealing with here and who these people are, and actually uncover their dark past in order to vanquish them. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this one. I think The Woman in Black is a story, I think, that it shows actually how maybe the relationship between kind of victim and villain can be a bit tricky. So it was actually written in 1983 by Susan Hill. There have been numerous adaptations. It's really successful as a stage play. Hammer released their own version not that long ago. The still actually is taken from a television version of this, which starred Pauline Moran as the Woman in Black, which I think has just had a re-release, which is good because it's great. There's kind of strong folk horror, you know, the naive young solicitor travels off to this kind of, you know, strange place with this strange house on an island, etc., etc. You probably all know the story. But kind of, I think what's really interesting is that, you know, in some ways it's quite a tragic story, because the Woman in Black herself actually had a pretty tragic life, and you know, a lot of like very, very, you know, difficult, really just terrible things happened to her. But what happens is that it is in death that she becomes this incessant, absolutely incessantly obsessed with revenge and maliciousness. So she becomes this embodiment really of rage and cruelty. And in a way, she becomes this kind of monstrous anti-mother, because she kind of, you know, particularly attacks children. So I mean, I actually still think I mean, I read it every now and again, and I still find it actually a really, really creepy story. But I think it's really interesting about how it shows how this, you know, effectively what is a tragic story actually becomes quite a frightening story. So yeah. And then of course, again, I'm sure many of you are really familiar with Monty James. He wrote lots and lots of ghost stories, and a lot of his stories revolve around malevolent ghosts. You know, all of these One to the Curious, Meditant, etc., etc., are effectively all about malevolent ghosts, and, you know, either righting wrongs or protecting places, or, you know, there's a strong theme within James's work of not venturing or not disturbing things, or of there being these kind of secret old ancient evils that have been kind of forgotten within the landscape, and the unsuspecting academic comes along and unearths them. But yeah, probably one of the best ghost story writers. But I think it's interesting to think about, look, people read these stories, and how do these ideas kind of seep into popular consciousness? Okay, so this is something also that I think is kind of interesting. I'd be really, really interested actually in kind of people's kind of feedback on this. This is kind of something that I've only started kind of looking at relatively recently, but it's this relationship between poltergeists and teenage girls, and the significant features that seem to be like combining these kind of stories. So these are two kind of pretty famous stories. Again, I expect you probably know them better than I do. There's Janet in Enfield, in the Enfield haunting. And then I didn't know about this until the Battersea Poltergeist podcast, but the case of Shirley in Battersea. You probably all heard the Battersea Poltergeist podcast. If not, it's, yeah, really, really good. And I think it's still available on BBC Sounds. What's kind of really interesting about both of these stories is that effectively what we have here, I mean, I'm not going to go into the logistics of fraud or whatever, I don't know, that's not my field. But I think what's interesting here is that we have these kind of young teenage girls, and people have written about this, that there is quite a high frequency of girls of a particular age being involved in kind of poltergeist cases, which is really interesting. But I think there's something about who the poltergeist is, and that I think is a bit creepy, because I think in both of these cases, what we find is that the poltergeist, or the identity that's kind of given to the poltergeist, is of an older male, who effectively is pretty predatory towards these girls. And it's just kind of curious, I think, about, well, what this is the relationship between these kind of quite very aggressive, kind of sort of predatory male figures and these kind of like, young girls who are kind of on the cusp of adulthood, and what that kind of relationship, I don't quite know what to make with that, so I'm interested in what people think. But there's something very frightening, I think, about this idea of like, there's a resonance, I think, within kind of everyday concerns, isn't there, about it's when our kids become adults, and then the anxiety of kind of what might be out there for them, and they're wanting to kind of protect our girls, I think, for example. I think another thing that's really interesting about kind of both of these cases, probably the Enfield case a bit more, is that the Enfield case has had, I think, two particular adaptations over the last kind of 10, 15 years. There was the Enfield haunting, which starred Timothy Spall and Matthew McFadden, which was a fair, I mean, I think it attempted at least to be a fairly faithful adaptation that was based on the events of what happened. I think it was actually, quite nicely done, explored some kind of really interesting themes and things. But then, of course, there was the second installment of the Conjuring franchise. And I remember coming out of that film and thinking, I had no idea this stuff happened at Enfield. And well, that's because it didn't. What I think is kind of interesting is, because even though, okay, we know these films and all those kind of things, is that, that films, think about how many people that actually went to actually go and see the Conjuring films who don't know anything about these cases at all. And kind of, okay, so what happens if we start telling these stories in a certain way? And I think what's really interesting is that, I mean, the Conjuring franchise basically takes stories and adds a whole load of demons, and the Warrens, because from what I can gather, the Warrens had very, very little involvement with the actual Enfield. I think they were there for an afternoon, if that. And yet, if you watch The Conjuring 2, they saved the world, so that's a kind of interesting translation. But I think it's interesting about how, because a lot of these films, they do sell themselves as being based on a true story. And I think it's kind of interesting. So what kind of happens to these stories, if they get kind of retold and in effect resold in these sorts of ways? But yeah, who knows? But I think it's kind of interesting to think about, the relationship between kind of these two aspects. But also, what's worth noting is, that in Stephen Volk's Ghost Watch, which was, best of my knowledge, was inspired by, at least to some degree, the Enfield haunting. Again, the identity of the poltergeist was of a child molester that had killed himself on the property. So again, that's really interesting. It's a very particular sort of character here. So anyway, I don't want to go on too much about that. But so there's this kind of strange dynamic there, I think. I always like to talk about Glamis Castle because Glamis Castle was my kind of introduction to ghost lore when I was about 9, and it really, really, really scared me. In Elliot O'Donnell's book Scottish Ghost Stories, and I think this is a really kind of interesting example of, again, it's a place where there's actually all kinds of different ghost stories going on. It's really, really, it's actually really old, even by British standards. I think was foundations were started in 1016. It's had ties with royalty since that time. There's a Macbeth connection because Malcolm II was murdered there, so they think this might actually be connected with Macbeth. What's interesting is if you look at the ghost lore in Glamis, we have ghosts of the elite, so of the lords, and so the people who own the house. One of the most famous stories is a character who they call Earl Beardy, if I've got that right, who's thought to be one of the lairds of Glamis, who gambled with the devil, as you do. And he's supposed to kind of appear as this in this knight's uniform, with a full case of armor leaning over you in bed. So I might not be tempted to stay at Glamis, actually. So there's those kind of stories of these kind of quite, kind of sinister spirits. But then there are also quite a few stories of that seem to be based on servants who have actually fallen foul of the elite and been either murdered or punished by them in some way. So that's a kind of, it's almost there's two different aspects. The history's kind of got these different layers to it. I mean, there's, I think it's a really kind of tantalizing place, like secret rooms and monstrous offspring and all those kind of things. But I think, there's a nice quote, and I remember hearing about this, that there's this idea about these places having these terrible secrets that nobody knows. So I think it's up on a website that talks about the ghosts of Glamis. They say, apparently just before the 13th Earl Strathmore died in 1904, he confided to a friend that the secret of Glamis was so horrifying that if his friend knew it, he would get down on his knees to give thanks it wasn't his secret. Which is, that's a shut it down the spine, that one. This is kind of a particular interest of mine, is thinking about kind of the role of asylum ghosts. And there's something particularly interesting about asylums are quite spectral places in and of themselves for various reasons. They're quite a popular setting for horror fiction, and this is something where I think we are more and more seeing just how much fictional representations influences public, kind of public understandings. There's a lot of things I think that people think happened in asylums or were done in asylums, but actually that they're probably coming from fiction. But there's, there seems to be quite a lot of films about this. There's something quite frightening about the asylum for a lot of different reasons, but particularly abandoned asylums. I mean, they are pretty spooky looking anyway. We don't have so many of them here anymore because they have all gradually been reintegrated. So most of them are now housing sites. In fact, the two asylums in Derby are both now housing estates. And but I think in America that there are a few more that are still there waiting for Zach and his gang. But it's interesting that a lot of asylum folklore a lot of its associated ghost lore seems to be quite malevolent. And what I found quite interesting when I started researching this is there's actually quite a significance of the malevolent spirits being doctors. It's not so much the patients, it's the doctors. And I think it reflects this anxiety about medical authority. And again, I think this is kind of where fiction has played a big hand in this. There's quite a lot of horror fiction involves this idea of these kind of phantom doctors who did experiments on people. And again, there's of course the monstrous history of psychosurgeries like lobotomy. And lobotomy is an interesting one because actually lobotomy was only on a mainstream scale was only really practiced for sort of 10-20 years. It was very, it was introduced in the 1930s, and it was not widely accepted within the medical community at that time. It was thought to be, yeah, people weren't sure about it, and it quite quickly fell out of favor. But if you if you kind of go by these films, you think it was going on for years, and everybody was like an incredibly excited advocate of it. So that's kind of interesting. But there is, there is something kind of interesting about this idea about kind of, the doctors actually, again, it's this, there's something about power here, that doctors are retaining this kind of hold over the places where they worked. Okay. And then kind of like sort of finally, there's something really interesting about, this kind of role of spectral lovers. And again, there's a few stories in sort of folklore stories about, they're kind of sad stories really, because particularly for women, for young women who were grieving the loss of a lover, either a husband or a partner or something, there was this kind of strange sort of theme here that you should not grieve for too long. And one of the reasons that you shouldn't grieve for too long is that if you do, you'll render yourself vulnerable for a ghost coming to basically take you with them to the land of the dead. And these are what these stories say, is that, a woman would be grieving for her lost lover, and then her lost lover would appear, and he would, she'd get on a horse with him, and they'd go, they'd go off. And then, as the picture shows, she'd realize that actually he is not that. He is something else. So, and in these kind of, there's some really interesting stories that kind of deal with this idea about kind of men coming back from the dead to kind of claim kind of women, and the themes about ownership and kind of all of those sorts of things. This idea about actually the ghosts can trick you. Yeah, sorry, I'm realizing time is going off, so I'm going to just rush into this bit. Right, so sorry, it's a bit of a whistle stop tour, I guess. Still, yeah, lots of things. I guess kind of, I suppose one of the things that sort of crops up, or in thinking about conclusions, or okay, so in a nutshell, there's kind of a very common belief, and I think this is really significant, and in many societies, that the dead needs to be appeased to prevent their malevolent potential. So I think one thing that I've probably not, I should have probably talked about a bit more, is the fact, in a lot of societies, there is this, it's the idea that the dead can potentially become malevolent. And what we have to do is that we have to make sure that they don't. So that there are all kinds, if you're familiar with, in China, for example, there is, during the 7th lunar month, the gates of hell are thought to open for, I think it's about 15 days, and the dead can walk amongst the living again. And during this time, there are all kinds of festivals and offerings and rituals for the dead. And, so for concerts, for example, the front row will always be left vacant, because that's, the dead will come and sit there. And there are various kind of also like kind of rules of things that you should and you shouldn't do during this time. So you shouldn't go swimming, and there are various places that you shouldn't go to. You shouldn't step in the ashes of a burnt offering, because people burn like hell. They have like paper money, and they have like paper cards, and they burn these things because they think that they can send them into into the afterlife for their families to have. And it's thought, some of the dead actually could be quite tricky, so they have to be careful to appease them. And there's a big emphasis on feeding them, and putting out lots of food that we feed the dead. So there's that element in which, that we do have to respect them and appease them, and just honor them, in certain ways. And there's a difference between kind of ancestors and the way that we do that, but also that there are other kind of spirits that might not be connected to us that we still just need to, be wary of. Again, there's a really strong emphasis on this importance of correct burial and remembrance. We need to be able to mourn and bury our dead. And if that can't happen, then that creates, there's something about the ritual of burial that's really, really important. So there's in a lot of societies, there's a sense of, if that doesn't happen, and of course, there's lots of reasons as to why that might not happen, and the spirit just cannot rest. It cannot rest without that kind of final goodbye, and also kind of a passing on to the next generation, if you like. There's also a strong sense within a lot of stories that, you know, spirits really can rage against their death. There's a kind of interesting idea that, you know, actually people that cannot accept that they have died cannot move on. And, you know, some people have written about this idea about, you know, that actually they're furious that they've been excluded from the membership of the living community. So there's something, yeah, there's something about that, there's something about that, I think, that's really, really powerful. And it, you know, there's some in some cases of spirit possession, not so much in the West, more in kind of other societies, of where actually the spirits will possess you because they're just desperate to feel what it's like to be inside a human body again. Sometimes, you know, these kind of perhaps the more malevolent or trickier, shall we say, spirits, they desire the company of the living, but they may also be very angry at the living. And sometimes this anger is quite indiscriminate. In a way, there is something about that they just become purely rage or purely anger in some way. That's a very frightening thought, I think. Again, we see a lot of issues to do with battles of power, authority, and presence. They maintain this is my house, this is my house, this is my space, this isn't yours. And that's all complicated and interesting about the relationship between the past and the present, perhaps. Again, there's quite a significant role of cultural and collective trauma, of historical memory and hauntings. You know, I think particularly in recent years when we've seen, you know, there's more aware, you know, kind of more people are more awareness about the terrible things that happen that often aren't spoken about, and actually how cultures can kind of come together and kind of talk about things that weren't spoken about. That can be quite healing, but that there's ghosts sometimes serve as a way of actually reminding us of things that we haven't dealt with or that we've tried to brush under the carpet. So there's a kind of, sometimes there's a sort of role of, I kind of want to say social justice, in the sense of, you know, trying to kind of actually speak out for the powerless, that the powerless aren't forgotten. And I do think that there is something quite interesting about the significance of fiction's influence in public consciousness, the allure of scary ghost stories around a campfire, if you like, you know, but the way in which I think sometimes these ideas kind of mingle in with each other. But then, of course, I mean, how many people decided to go into ghost investigation because you watched Ghostbusters? Anyway, that's a slightly, I think a slightly more was to stop than I hoped, but I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for listening. I shall be quiet now.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was really, really interesting. It was a lovely description of how fiction and religion can affect one's belief, really. Everyone's saying thank you very much. Do we have any questions for Hannah? We've had quite a few comments in the chat section. I'm going to go through a few of them. Unless CJ, did you want to say something first?
Yeah, I'll start with a question. So,
okay.
On the subject of heroes and villains, we often, in the spiritualist community at least, we often see spiritualists being depicted as villains, as being predatory upon the sick, preying upon the bereaved, etc. I would like to say that there's an alternative perspective which sees them as heroes who actually provide closure, who help companies find, both the dead and the living, find comfort and find joy. As a psychologist, is there much actual harm done, do you believe, by the spiritualist discourse, or are the overall benefits in terms of bereavement net positives?
That's a great question. Okay, I will be honest. I mean, I personally think that mediumship can be very, very helpful for people in a way that I think that the problem is that, particularly for like sudden bereavements, really difficult bereavements, contemporary medical counseling, shall we say, maybe is not, there's sometimes an emphasis on, right, you've got to accept this person has died. And that is, I think, easier for some than others. But I think, I mean, I would get, you know, because I spend quite a lot of time, you know, talking to mediums and, you know, going to spiritual services. And I have a very kind of really deep affection for that community. And certainly the people I met, what really came across was you know, that actually they do care about people. And I think I think if anything, it gives you a chance to talk about somebody that you love and think about them in a positive way. And I mean, I don't know a lot of the research on this and things, but my own sense is that I think I'm a bit reluctant to get too caught up, because I think it's a really interesting point, CJ, and certainly when I was doing kind of my research, there's a lot of this, medium to this and medium to this and medium to this, and that was absolutely not my experience at all. I'm not saying that there aren't people, and I think there are people who take advantage of that, but I think the problem is that idea of the medium as, they prey on the weak and all this kind of stuff is kind of really exaggerated within the media. And I think that the truth is that it's not, I don't think people are, I mean, there are, yes, I mean, and I've heard some stories, but on the whole, I think actually it's you're there to tell someone that, they're loved, and that I think personally, I think it's really helpful, but I don't know enough of the literature, but my feeling is that I think so long as it's ethical, and I think the thing is, I think a lot of mediums are, I think it can be really helpful. So it's a bit blabbery.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go through some of the comments that we've had. I might have to scroll back a little bit because sometimes I have to sift through the conversations as well. Aaron says there was a case, he thinks Andrew Mackenzie mentions it, about an American soldier who was haunted by a Vietnam soldier he killed and followed him back to the States. Dave Sivia also commented, there was an interesting program a few years ago about the Vietnamese government, despite being an atheist, communist state, having a program of finding and recovering the bodies of those killed during the war. Caroline asks, do you think with adolescent girls and hormone changes, it makes them more susceptible to these entities?
Yeah, that's so the Vietnam comments. No, that's really interesting. And I think actually there was something during the Vietnam War that the American troops actually used to play things. They used to helicopter over, and they used to play messages, and that. So there's something really kind of sinister about that. But yeah, there has actually been a renewed effort to try and find, like, people are still quite actively trying to find the bodies of their ancestors so that they can bury them. I think that's been similar in other places as well. Interestingly, there's somebody pointed this out to me a while ago, that obviously something quite similar happened in Cambodia with the killing fields. There are, I have a friend who's visited them, and there are, I'm afraid, still bones and things there. But what happened was that they saw this huge flock of butterflies that kind of rose up from the field, and it was thought that this was indicative of that the souls had moved on. So that was kind of interesting as well. But yeah, there is a lot of work going on about trying to recover bodies and things like that. But yeah, the question about poltergeists, it's really interesting, because there does seem to be, I can't remember who it is who's I think a few people have researched this, and I know that this has been suggested, that there's something significant about girls at a certain age. And I think, puberty is a very chaotic time. At the best, it's chaotic. And that maybe there is something going on that is contributing to that. So I think that's more of a sort of trying to explain what causes poltergeist activity. That maybe there is something about being at a particular moment in your life that is quite kind of emotionally and hormonally chaotic, that might have some relationship. But then of course there's plenty of poltergeist cases where it's not teenage girls, so, but yeah, I don't know, but there is some research on this somewhere, I think.
I popped a question in there as well, because I knew I'd forget about it. It's when you're talking about appeasing the dead and paying your respects, would you argue that the malevolent dead are not the responsibility of the living? So for example, you went on to talk about how having a proper burial in many cultures is very important, letting people rest, move on. Would you say that part of that is out of apprehension? And would you also say that, for example, malevolent people who are alive, you wouldn't want to appease them in any way? So would you say in death they are our responsibility, or, in your opinion?
No, that's a great question. I think the difference is as well in that the thing about, I think sometimes I think these things are a little bit tricky for us because we live in a culture that's very individualistic. So in a sense, you know, we might not actually go to the funerals of members of our family, and that's not considered a particularly, you know, strange thing. I think the thing is that within cultures that tend to be more collectivist, you are bound to your society. And so it is always yours, you know, there's a lot, you know, it is your they are your responsibility, because actually where, you know, we have quite sort of boundaries around ourselves, you know, and that myself is the most important, you know, kind of thing. Whereas in other cultures, there is a sense in which actually my society is more important than me. So there is always, you have your obligations to other people are very important. And that is, yeah, so but I think the thing about apprehensive though is important because people are frightened of what they will do, you know. So there is a huge element in which, you know, it's like warding off evil spirits with charms and things. You are frightened of what they will do, you know, and you know, and then certainly there are lots in a lot of places. There are places where you don't go because that is where they, you know. I mean, I'm sure we can all think of places where, you know, haunted woods or haunted bog or whatever it is, you know, places where you thought you shouldn't go because there are ghosts. Of course, every teenager who's looking for a thrill goes to those places. But you know, so there's an idea that certain places you don't go into. So, but no, I mean, that's a really, yeah, it's a good, because I think another thing is, you know, you're thinking about, I suppose we don't really have that many traditions of appeasing the dead in our society, so sometimes it feels a bit strange. But yeah, I mean, it's a point, isn't it? You know, people are pretty unpleasant in life. I mean, I don't, you know, they didn't deserve it when they were alive. I don't think they deserve it now. So, but it is kind of interesting.
Thank you. Aaron also asks, could one of the earliest forms of a malevolent spirit come from the Egyptians with the car and the curse of the tombs if they are disturbed?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it was interesting as well that they there's also the sense, isn't it, that in the Egyptian concept that the soul actually split into different parts. So there was, it's like the shadow part of you. So it's not entirely you, but it's like there's a split. So I think it's and I wish Carl was here because I know Carl's written about this, so he would know. That there's like 5 parts and that different parts of you go to different places. So, but yeah, there is also the sense in which, yeah, absolutely, watching over tombs to disturb, you know. I mean, there's also a tendency that they're, you know, it's always sometimes a bit tricky because of, you know, spirits that are human in origin, but also that are thought to be supernatural beings within their own right, and then you have this role in which sometimes you employ evil spirits to protect you from other evil spirits, and sometimes I think some of the Egyptian curses worked a little bit like that, but it was really that you know, you don't disturb people's resting places. So
I think that's
apparently they found like 200 or so mummies over the last 10 years, so we haven't taken any notice of the curse of Tutankhamun.
I always said if I was going to get buried, I'd like to be dug up for historical purposes.
Absolutely.
Not that I'd find much out. Right, okay. Kieran asks, how common is it to have ghost stories where a living person suffers a sort of possession syndrome at the hands of a murder victim to loved ones of the people who betrayed her to her death? Good question.
Oh, that's a good one. I don't know how common it is, but I would expect that there are stories. That's okay. That's given me somewhere to have a look for. I like that. That's a great question. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Kieran. Lots of people saying excellent talk. Jackie asks, do you think there are equal numbers of pleasant non-predatory ghosts to poltergeists, but reported less?
I would expect so, yeah. To be honest with you, my feeling is yes. I mean, this is the thing. Sometimes is you know, wanting to. I think for all of these like scary ghost stories, there are just as many that aren't. You know, of people. You know, I mean, the thing is, sometimes I think you spend too much time with this literature. Not only can you not sleep, it's also kind of muddies the water a bit. But I think there's lots of also cases of, you know, sort of ghost stories of where people protect you. and where they help you, or they might save you from something. So it's not all kind of, it's not all doom and gloom. But I think that's a really interesting point, Jackie, because I think there is what does get reported, what gets told, what gets regurgitated, what things, I mean, I get the sense within like ghost stories, they tend to be scary stories about scary ghosts, but that's because horror is an incredibly lucrative genre and it sells really, really well. So, and I think those are the stories that people tend to sell more.
Of course, it's how you interpret it, how you interpret the activity as well. Right, iPhone SE. If my memory serves me correctly, that's Nigel. Even religion can prey on the weak. I think a lot of mediums are good and well-meaning. Are attacks on mediums only an extension of religious bigotry against something or someone that a religion can't accept?
Or is this the tax? Is this about the tax?
Attacks, yeah.
Yeah. I think one thing that's also really interesting, mediums have had a pretty rough time, actually, particularly in regards to the law, because, again, apologies, because I'm sure some of you will know this already, but there was, it was effectively what was the Witchcraft Act that became, that kind of, I think that, if I remember rightly, I could be wrong, has the seeds of that then became the Fraudulent Mediums Act in 1951, I think that was when it was. But it was, previously it was the Witchcraft Act. And now the Witchcraft Act originally was that effectively of anybody being accused of being a witch. But then later on it became if you tried to pass yourself off as a witch. So what's really interesting is that when actually, at times when actually the general consensus was that witches were a very real and present danger, and there's no doubting that they're in league with the devil. So we need to deal with them. But obviously that's in that way. But I think it's during the Enlightenment period where people started thinking, actually, I don't think witchcraft really exists. Then it actually became about, well, actually, you're going to pass yourself off as that, though, then that's a problem. So yeah, there was, and this was one of the, I think, the problems that happened for mediums as well, is that it became about if you're going to pass yourself off as that. And this was also collected with the Helen Duncan case, which because she was, and again, do correct me if my memory serves me right, that there was also Winston Churchill was quite instrumental in this, and he visited Helen Duncan because he was quite sympathetic, and I think he was kind of involved in overturning that act. But I think gradually I think that the situation that we're in now is that you have to have a caveat of saying this is for entertainment purposes only. And I think, people could, again, I might be wrong about that. That's certainly how it is for a lot of ghost investigations, for example. But I can understand why people might be upset about that, because I'm not sure that in other circumstances that there's a caveat. I don't expect that if I go to church service that the caveat is that this is for entertainment purposes only, and nor should it be. I don't think that it should be. So we're mediumship is I think still not really, it's still a sort of a tricky subject, I think.
It's a bit of a grey area, but I do agree that Helen Duncan was treated quite badly. Let's have a look. Matthew Arnold. I heard recently from one lecturer that the concept of the haunted house is a specifically English thing, and there's not much evidence for it elsewhere in historical cultures worldwide. Is this the case?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a really good question. I'm not sure about that. I suspect so. However, I would expect to encounter it in Europe, and certainly it's very common in America. It has been for quite a long time. I wouldn't like to say with any authority on that, actually, but it is.
Hannah?
Yeah.
Athenodorus in the 3rd century BC gives the first description of a haunted house in Athens. And we have haunted houses recorded in India, Russia, South America, North America, and Japanese cultures over the last millennium and a half. So I would dispute the claim extremely strongly.
Oh, thank you, CJ. That's good, because I kind of wanted to say that, but CJ said that with much more authority. So one thing that's interesting in Japan, there is like no, this is happening in America, that you can find out if anybody died in your house before you buy it. Because I think there's a tendency in Japan that people are a little bit reluctant to buy houses where people have died in it. But I think now you can actually there's like a website or something where you can actually look to see whether anything bad has happened in your house, and people have to have a disclaimer if something has happened there, which is really interesting.
Not very good for the seller.
Nope.
Let's have a look. Aaron, that's probably why we have a global pandemic after disturbing 200 tombs. Nigel says, is different cultures' attitudes to the dead and spiritual a reason for hauntings? Some cultures celebrate the deceased regularly, whereas in the UK we seem to bury the dead and forget about them. Not me, though. As in not Nigel.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that I think one of the things that's always really interests me is the fact that every society has ghosts, has ghost stories, has ghost beliefs. It's not just stories, it's that people will have seen them. So I think that's kind of something that's also really important, is that there's a folklorist called David Hufford who introduced, it's called the experiential source hypothesis, because one of the general consensuses tended to be that people that live in a culture that believes in ghosts will see ghosts. But actually what quite a lot of research suggests is that isn't the case. It works the other way around. People have experiences of something, and then the kind of explanations for that come afterwards. So I think the thing is that there is a relationship between, people in all kind of different cultures experience things that they can't explain, or that that are unusual in some way, or that they feel that they see ghosts effectively. But I think it's interesting. I don't know what other people think, but I don't know if ghost sightings or things have gone up or gone down, or whether it changes. There's one thing that was interesting in I think it's Owen Davis's book, which is his social history of ghosts, it suggests that ghosts seem to have a reasonably limited time span, so you wouldn't actually see ghosts of all that far back. But I don't think that seems to be the case. I mean, having lived in York for 15 years, we've got a good few thousand years of ghosts and people were seeing, Vikings, Romans, a lot, So that's kind of interesting. But I think there is a sense in which people didn't generally see really, really like Viking ghosts or Roman ghosts. So whether that's something to do with television or something, I don't know. But I don't know whether I don't know whether there is like a trend where there's like more people are seeing ghosts or not. I think it's always been common. And I think that's the thing, it's always been, maybe not the majority of a population, but I think it's always been quite common. I think one of the things, to get back to an earlier point that someone made, is the fact that people don't talk about it.
If you want some figures, 1894, 1 in 9, or 1 in 9.4, which is where the figure of 1 in 10 people see ghosts come from. That's the 1894 sense of hallucination. 1973, Celia Green finds about the same figure. 1990, Donald J. West finds the same figure, around about 1 in 9. And 2013, Becky, when she repeated the sense of hallucination figures, found exactly the same figure. So it's staying static around 1 in 9 to 1 in 10 across the last 130 years. This is the kind of dull fact I remember.
No, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. I mean, because when I started my research, so this is going back to like mid like 2000, 2003, 2004 sort of time. It felt as though there was this sudden implosion of like ghost investigation shows and mediumship demonstration shows, like people like John Edward and James Van Prague, and they were accumulating quite big audiences. I remember actually watching when Most Haunted started. It's quite it was not a little show really, and I remember one of their first live events. It was kind of a modest audience, and yet a few years later, it was huge. There was loads more people involved, loads more people watching it. And so it felt like, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, that there was like, it was really, really, really popular. Lots of people were really into it. And now it seems to have sort of died down, although I'm not sure, because there still seem to be a lot of these programs about, you know.
But do you think it runs on a 20-year cycle? Because in the 1970s, we had an explosion of interest in the paranormal, which kind of culminates with things like Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious Worlds. And throughout the 70s, there's a real strong interest in psi research, and it goes over into the early 80s. And then there's a big skeptical reaction to that under Randy and people like that in the 80s. But then the 90s, we had the X-Files, and we had a huge, I mean, I can remember the time when there were something like 6 separate high street monthly UFO magazines in W.H. Smith's, but there was nothing about ghosts apart from the 40 Times at the time. But there were about 6 separate magazines on UFOs. And then 20 years on from that, right about 13 years later, 2003, when I was working on Most Haunted, suddenly there were 5 or 6 magazines on ghosts and none on UFOs, and we were having an ASSAP conference on the end of ufology. So maybe the phenomena stays constant, but the explanations come in waves. I don't know. One of the things Beck argued was that if you look at the 1894 census and her 2013 replication, the base experience when you take it from the individual as a first-hand account is almost identical, and she carried out some basic qualitative stuff, but also a bit of quantitative stuff, and on both levels the experiences in 1894 were the same very much as the experiences, which suggested that it was an experiential source, not a cultural source, and that all of the interesting things that have happened culturally in our depiction of ghosts don't seem to impact that much on the actual experiences, which is odd, isn't it?
Yeah, this really fascinates me, because I just think, that's really interesting. That's really interesting.
It suggests there's some kind of authenticity to it, or there's an experience that underlies it, and that then drives our culture, and each generation interprets it in its own way. Anyway, I'll shut up now. So
No. I think that's really interesting.
Christopher Lawson, one of our previous speakers, says, "So great to see you, Hannah. Has anyone heard of ghosts arising around the current pandemic? Very interested in how victims and villains are associated with the historical events. So it has me wondering, particularly noting the Japanese tsunami ghosts, are there major historical traumas that you found associated with the ghosts in recent decades?"
Yeah, that's a great question. I think with the weird early, I think if there